thanks for the government of the Kingdom of Bahrain and the IISS for inviting me and recruiting me on short notice to speak at this session. And I think that, I'll try and frame things from what we see on a daily basis as we try and deal with current issues in the area. From the UAE's perspective, we see basically three major themes, and many things really fall within these three major themes. I think the first thing we see is we work very hard to what I call a return to stability. A return to stability after almost a decade of chaos and a decade of challenges, where we've seen these challenges actually affecting also the whole situation with terrorism and extremism. So everything we really do as the UAE is concerned is about a return to stability, and it's not necessarily a return to the status quo. These are two different things, because one ought to also learn from what we've seen that there is no return to the status quo, but we do seek a return to stability. In that context, we feel that gaps have allowed major insurgencies, terrorist insurgencies, to gain a foothold. I mean, the classic one is ISIS in Iraq and Syria. This was one of the gaps that we've seen, and I think denying territory to terrorist organizations is a big, really lesson. We have to do that, and I think we've seen it also in ISIS. It's taken a lot of effort, but it's been successful in Iraq, and we congratulate the Iraqi government on its success here. This is also taking place in Yemen. In Yemen, we're tackling AQAP, which is one of the more dangerous terrorist organizations, and we've seen that in denying a similar scenario to ISIS, through capturing Mukalla, for example, back from AQAP. All this is important. The return to stability is not only important to us in the region, but it's also important to other parts of the world because of the fluid nature of the challenge of extremism and terrorism. The Middle East, as a former Swedish foreign minister said, is in Europe, and Europe is in the Middle East. You cannot really separate the two. We can see the impact of crisis in the region on the whole issue here. So a return to stability is important, and a return to stability is really a support for a Westphalian nation state. This is necessary. It's much easier to break these institutions in countries that were mostly formed in the last 70, 80 years than to try and put them back together. So I think this is for us a major issue, and this is something that the UAE works every day, and as a major guiding light for our policy is a stable neighborhood is good for us, and we want to be part of a stable neighborhood. And a stable neighborhood also with nation states that are capable of defending their internal sort of dynamics and so on and so forth will actually support us in denying organizations such as Daesh or others, or AQAP or others, of controlling swaths of territory or organizing or financing, and I think this is a major issue. The second issue is, of course, Iran. And for us, Iran is playing a very disruptive role in the whole regional issue. I think, number one, through sectarian rhetoric, and number two, through building proxies. And these two areas we're facing every day. We're facing it with Hezbollah and Hezbollah's role in destabilizing beyond its commitment to Lebanon. We're seeing it destabilizing in other countries. Bahrain has suffered from that. Kuwait has suffered from that. And we're seeing also Hezbollah's fingerprints in Yemen. So clearly, Iran is playing a role. It is accepting that its proxies are using, the rhetoric and the action, the terrorist action, to play a role in order to gain political advantage in the geopolitical, polarization that we're seeing in the area. And I think there is another issue that also is that we have to be cognizant of, is the sectarian messaging. This is something that, we don't really, as the UAE, see ourselves necessarily as a Sunni state. We see ourselves as a national state. And I think this is important for us as we move forward. It is extremely important, if we are really looking for stability, to try and replace the sectarian rhetoric, whether it's Sunni or Shia, which has dominated a lot of the fringe and sometimes perhaps centers of political debate in the region, because you will always have a counter narrative whatever you do here. And I think this is extremely important to tackle. And if you hear, at the ugly part of it, much of this sectarian rhetoric is aimed at trying to undermine the other group, whether the sectarian narrative is Sunni or the sectarian narrative is Shia, and it actually affects a lot of a much younger demographic that we are seeing in the region. The third issue that we're very concerned about, and we remain to be very concerned about, is this link between extremism and terrorism. We cannot really defeat terrorism without defeating extremist narrative. It is, you don't have to challenge if you're seen, you don't have to challenge the terrorist narrative, but you have to challenge the extremist narrative. And I think this link is very important for us. And I think this is one of the areas where many people think that the UAE is extreme in its view by identifying, for example, groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood as, as an extremist group, etc. But, all indications show that the Muslim Brotherhood is in many ways very fluid in what it sees as its tools. It is willing to use calls for violent action to undermine Egypt, but perhaps to use more, let's say, quote-unquote, democratic language in European milieu. And I think this is something that we have seen consistently of an organization, depending on the milieu, of trying to represent itself to different people in different forms. And this is why we think there is a link. There is a clear link. And for us to tackle extremism and terrorism, we always hear about this sort of comprehensive approach, finance and narrative and, military security. And we agree with that. But part of agreeing with that is that we do really have to tackle the extremist narrative, because it is the extremist narrative that is justifying, that is mobilizing, that is creating this polarizing issue. We don't feel so lonely anymore on this issue, because unfortunately events in the last 5-6 years have proven us right. Unfortunately, I say it because it's been done at a cost in lives, at a cost in security, but we don't feel lonely here. And I think from this perspective, again, a word, because it's perhaps one of the small elephants in the room, is Qatar. And a word about that. I mean, our crisis is not a crisis where we're trying to put a small state really in line with a collective policy. I mean, if you really think about it, the GCC is one large state, Saudi Arabia, and 5 small states. And from that perspective, it'll be preposterous to really believe the issues of sovereignty. All GCC countries have independent foreign policies. We have what we think is an independent foreign policy within a GCC environment. Oman has one, Kuwait has one. But the issue here with Qatar is, sincerely, it's a small state, but a very wealthy state that is using some of its wealth, immense wealth, as a platform to support jihadist rhetoric, to support jihadist groups. And this is something quite opportunistic that we have seen since the beginning of the Arab Spring, where they put, all their chips basically on this jihadist agenda. And as a result, I think addressing our demands as a framework for a constructive discussion, the 13 demands as a framework for a constructive discussion and solution is really necessary. Now, Qatar is really under our pressure, is doing things that it should have done many years ago, which is basically sign agreements to curb terrorist financing, change its laws in order to retrial many people who are basically roaming around free, etc. But I think this is a major, major issue in our whole approach. Again, I have to come and say a word about President Trump's Jerusalem's decision. I think it is these issues that actually are, a gift to radicalism. I mean, radicals and extremists will use that to fan the language of hate, to, sort of use it, not because they are interested in Jerusalem or they're interested in an overall, a two-state solution, but because they are interested in utilizing that in the current polarization that we are seeing in the current state. I'm really, really surprised that the Americans have this wonderful platform here to explain the Jerusalem decision, and they're really not here. I think they should have all been here and explained that decision, because it does really need a lot of convincing and communication to come and say, yes, this is drastic, but it's not changing anything. Well, I think that this is really another opportunity lost, and I think that what we will really see is, a fanning of or trying to utilize that decision in order to settle scores here. I'm not necessarily worried about today and tomorrow and the day after, but what I'm worried about, that a few years down the road, that some people are going to see the Jerusalem decision as a turning point. Sometimes the same way we think of the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, or we think of some other, events that have proven to be watersheds. I hope not, but this is a worry for me. Again, I will end here by saying that part of defeating extremism is rejuvenating the nation state, the rejuvenating and creating credibility for the Arab nation state, but this has to be also part of a wider Arab system. I see Saudi Arabia as key here. I see Egypt as key here. I see Iraq also in our approach of opening up to Iraq, and Iraq's approach also to opening up to many of the Arab countries. I see all these as key states. I see us, the UAE, as playing an important role in this, what I would call, core coalition of moderate states. I see Jordan playing a role here. I think a large part of what has taken place in the Arab world is because we have lost the ability to defend the Arab state system. We've seen countries like Iran and Turkey play an oversized role in what we have seen, and at the same time, the weakness of the Arab state has created these gaps where extremists and terrorists have flourished, whether it's Somalia, whether it's Yemen, or whether it's Iraq and Syria. A large part also of this is our ability to carry some of the burden. And I think this has also been a driving force in the UAE's approach. We have to be part of the countries that actually carry the burden. We cannot any longer be financiers for our security, but we have to be at the forefront. And I think taking that into consideration, it explains the UAE's long engagement in Afghanistan for over a decade, our engagement in Somalia, our current engagement in Yemen. Part of it is understanding that a robust and a stable region needs also our contribution, and our contribution can not be only a financial contribution. And the other part also of this is we have to be at the forefront in order to protect the sum of our region. Thank you very much. Thank you.